Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I'm Tracy Delaney, and I'm chair of the Northwest International Committee. Last month, presidential election in Bolivia resulted in a landslide victory for the movement towards socialism, or MAS. Almost 1 year after it was forced out in a US-backed coup. Following the coup, a brutal right-wing government was installed which undone the progressive work of Evo Morales and the MAS and implemented neoliberal economic policies, attacked workers and trade unions, and massacred indigenous protesters. Most mainstream media coverage provided support for the coup, despite widespread human rights violations being committed by the security forces. However, a well-organised resistance of the Bolivian working class and indigenous people fought back, leading to a new election which saw the MAS candidate Luis Lucho Arce elected in a landslide. This meeting will look at what the re-election of the MAS in Bolivia means for Bolivian workers, trade unions, the media, and the country and the region as a whole in Latin America. Tonight we've got 3 great speakers for you this evening. We've got Francisco Dominguez, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We've got Anya Parampil and Claudia Turbet-Delof. The meeting's been organised by Unison Northwest and it's also supported by Albarada. In terms of the format, each speaker will have around 15 minutes to share their views and their contribution to the meeting. And then after this, as I mentioned before, we should have time for some questions and a discussion following this. Just to let you know, the meeting is being recorded and will be posted on Unison's Northwest page after this event. Our first speaker is Claudia Turbet-Delof. Claudia is a Bolivian trade union, a labour ward organiser and lead coordinator for Whiplash across the world, a collective of Bolivian nationals across Europe, the Americas and Australia. Claudia lives in the UK, so it's great to welcome her to tonight's meeting. So welcome, Claudia.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for the invite. As you were saying, I am a Bolivian national living in the UK. It is a phenomenal time at the moment to be Bolivian and to be living abroad. I'm going to use this space to take advantage of the key and really keen interest that you pay into Bolivia. And I'm going to say that that is a very important interest for Bolivians, both in Bolivia and in all of the countries where we reside. And the reason why I say this is because it is really important that we as Bolivians and all Latin America receive the support of international brothers and sisters, because when we have US-backed policies and campaigns trying to destroy our policies and take over our resources, it's really hugely important that you guys are aware of what everything is going on in countries like Bolivia, so in that you can chip in with your support at a timely manner and support us in what now is the recovery of the democracy in Bolivia. So I just want to maybe start by saying what this means for us as Bolivians. I am living in the UK. It has been a very difficult scene, as you probably know yourself, what happened last year in November 2019. Bolivia has had 14 years of socialism, where people like myself saw our country just grow day in and day out, and seeing the economy really blossom, seeing our people, our family access education, health, and really having a better quality of life. And I have to admit, I'm one of the many people, and maybe the millions, that we felt that everything was okay, and that we didn't really pay attention to what the opposition was doing. I felt as a Bolivian that the opposition was being themselves, meaning that they were being racist, as they always are, being, trying to divide Bolivia into two countries. Many of you might know that there is an intention of divide Bolivia in two countries, the Media Luna and the rest of the Occident. And this based on the fact that this Media Luna, these three cities, have this very huge oligarchy bases that are what has sort of the legacy of fascism in Bolivia. So people like myself never really, I mean, I didn't, and that's with all honesty, I was very much involved with everything that is in the UK, trade unionism in the UK. I'm a trade unionist myself and United Voices of the World. I'm a migrant, I'm a former cleaner. So fighting our own struggles in the UK, and then this happens. Because then we realized that the far right had been working really consistently with the United States in trying to topple the power in Bolivia, Evo Morales. It was a controversial election that he had, that he went for, because as Bolivians, what the message was, or the rhetoric that was given, is that he was violating the constitution, but he wasn't. And then anyway, so the elections happened, and as you know, then Yanine Áñez comes in, and I think there was this key moment that I feel very special to share, and is that the police and the mob that are from majority of these fascist group, paramilitary groups like Unión Juvenil Cruceñista and Resistencia Juvenil Cochala, which are these paramilitary groups that they call themselves defenders of the democracy, sovereignty, but actually just a mob and thugs that really cannot coexist with all the nations that we have in Bolivia. And there was a key moment where they burned the Huipala. And this key moment, and I have the Huipala just here at the back. The Huipala is a symbol of the indigenous people, not just in Bolivia, but other Latin American countries. It symbolizes is a perfect square. And I really would like you to pay attention to this after perhaps this session. You got a little bit more of reading on the Huipala. The Huipala is the representation of indigenous people, and every square has a meaning. Every color has a meaning. And essentially, because we, or the indigenous people in Bolivia, do have do believe in La Pachamama. La Pachamama is a god, and the living well, which is the Summa Camaña, it's a meaning, a philosophy of life. Now, when that Huipala is burned, essentially what they say is the Huipala doesn't have a place anymore in parliament. I think there was a key moment for Bolivians abroad, especially, because that really signified that they really wanted to ban all forces, all indigenous representation in government. I'm myself not indigenous as such. I'm Afro-Bolivian, and I have a bit of mix of Brazilian, Argentinian, and Bolivian and African. But as a Bolivian national, I know that the forces, that these fascist forces have always existed. Burning the Huipala and saying that they don't have a place anymore in government was a very painful moment to see that they did that in front of the people. And I think what this caused is that really empowered people to say no. We do not want to go back to what we had been living for decades, and is that if you're indigenous, you cannot access the schools that the oligarchy groups will access. You do not access health. You do not aspire to have a better quality of life. And that was a force that in Bolivia, indigenous people really didn't want to go back. The far right gained momentum, and there was this moment where people, especially in my city, Santa Cruz de la Sierra and Beni, which is where Yanine Áñez is from, they really rise to the moment because they do feel that they are now the saviors of Bolivia. I think it's really important to mention this bit because there was this apparent leadership that took place with the far right. And they started releasing videos of how they would kill indigenous people. And I want to emphasize on this as well, because I don't think a lot of people in the world understand or know, because of course you're not in Bolivia, the depth of the racist attacks that happens on a daily basis by the far right, which used to be the groups that run the country before Evo Morales. It used to be the groups that used to run the companies, our natural resources, our hospitals, our education centers. So these people suddenly, before Evo Morales came, of course, they had total, control. And after Evo Morales, they lose massive contracts. So there is a huge amount of anger in them that from November 2019, they used against us. They start attacking us, they start organizing, and they start insulting, and they start, as you said, killing indigenous people, especially systematically, indigenous people, indigenous towns. The bit that I think is quite key, especially for Bolivians abroad, is that moment of absolute abuse against indigenous people upset, of course, everyone in Bolivia, or most people in Bolivia. There was the factional group that they felt that they were saving the country, and they felt that they did feel that they were doing they were bringing libertad, liberty to Bolivia, or freedom to Bolivia. I don't know if I'm translating that properly, but libertad for Bolivians. These people, the far right group, have managed to gain momentum at a time. They do go to Bolivia. They do go to La Paz. They're going to Parliament. They bring the Bible. They burn the Huipala. And then officially, there is a process. There is a period of time where indigenous people are told you don't have place in government. I think that's the key moment, because then is when there is this empowerment that comes from within. There is this anger that comes from within. There is this resistance that comes, collective resistance, where people in Bolivia start saying, no, we do not want to go back to that. And then they resist this oppression, military oppression, because the military comes in. What is asked for Bolivians abroad, and I think this is a very key bit within this struggle, is that unlike other struggles in the past, Bolivians abroad have not had perhaps this level of organization. And I really like how you introduced it earlier. You said there was a well-organized resistance, and that's what we did abroad. The many groups that were created, we created one called Huipalas Across the World, and that's the one how I also collaborated with Francisco. And Francisco helped us immensely with his very kind and very usual support for communities in the UK and all over the world. We organized to the point that we supported the people in Bolivia, but what we didn't know is what happened next, is that I don't think we created anything new within Huipalas Across the World, but what we did is that we helped bring a platform that was before not that public, and that is that pride in being indigenous, the pride of being from a pre-national state of Bolivia, and that sense of pride that we are a country that can coexist within different communities. One of the, just checking the time, I have a few more minutes. One of the things that was, I think, very important, and the meaning, I guess, for Bolivians abroad is that the 14 years of is called Proceso de Cambio, process of change of El MAS party, is that it really was about the social struggle, the social movement. It wasn't sort of like electorate type of, like it happens in many other parties. It really was about us, civic society, social movements, social struggles getting together. The international Bolivians, or Bolivians abroad, played a key role in bringing this, because Ana Castilla is a question about the social media, and that's what I'm coming to as well. is that one of the biggest struggles for Bolivia and all what's happening in Bolivia is that the media abandoned them. Bolivia was abandoned by mainstream media, and it was really difficult to see any publication about the coup in Bolivia. And for a long time, actually, a lot of media outlets really just supported the recovery of democracy that Yanine Áñez had brought for Bolivia, saying that Evo Morales was a dictator and he left and then he escaped. Not even that, you know, he was forced to leave, but literally that he was escaping. So the media play a big role in that process of lie that, you know, OEAS and Almagro said that it was fraud, but actually was never there. But I think as Bolivians abroad, and I guess this is a bit where personally I find really proud, and I guess as a trade unionist as well, we learned to organize, we learned to go to spaces that we're not wanted, we learned to go to places where we're definitely not wanted. And as Bolivians, we apply a lot of those trade unionist policies where we went to spaces that we knew we wouldn't be wanted. We held international campaigns with palaces across the world. It started in Europe, but then it expanded. So then we joined up with the United States. We joined up with people in Australia. We joined up with about 11 countries in Europe. So it has become a pretty big network of Bolivians. And whenever there was something that happened in Bolivia, for example, when the COP called for the strike, the general strike, we all united and we were supporting our comrades in Bolivia. I think it's really, just to end this bit of my intervention, I think it's really fair to say that the process of change has empowered a lot of us Bolivians, not only in Bolivia, but abroad. It really has meant a lot for us to fight for our democracy. And it really has meant a lot to not wanting to come back to where we were before. Only last week I was called monkey, ape by a far-right person that does not agree with our campaign. And that is the next bit of the work that we need to do as Bolivians and also the world. You know, we need to Creemos by Camacho, which is the opposition, this thug, I think, no in my view, a leader, has some power now in government, and that's something that we need to work with and the reparation process. Yes, I'll stop it there and I'll be open for questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. Certainly a lot to think about, but yeah, definitely an example of what organising can do. And I think people's understanding of what organising isn't necessarily what we mean when we talk about it in these forums. I know some people just think it means setting your diary out for the day, which is a lot more technical than that. So it's certainly an example for everybody. And I think Latin America does lead the way in a lot of that.
Thank you. We didn't, so just say, you know, and Francisco knows this because he again supported us a lot. A lot of us, I mean, our movement became a massive movement, but a lot of us, you know, on many occasions didn't sleep because we lived on the London time, but also Bolivian time. So it is a lot of work. But I really believe that trade unionism was the foundation for organizing. Thank you.
It is. We will have time for questions at the end, so if you've got anything specific, just make a note of it, because we'll move on to our second speaker tonight, who is Anya Parampil. Anya's the host of Red Lines on the Grey Zone YouTube channel. She's produced and reported several documentaries, including on-the-ground reports in Venezuela, Bolivia, Honduras, Palestine, and the Korean Peninsula. It's great to have you with us tonight, Anya, so welcome.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you for the invitation to speak here today. I'm very happy to speak alongside Francisco and Claudia and to get the chance to discuss my time in Bolivia. I recently returned from the country. I had to rush back to witness my own elections here, but first I spent the better part of October in Bolivia, traveling around the country, and not only working as a journalist this time, my team from the Gray Zone was actually accredited by the Bolivian government to work as official electoral observers in Bolivia. So for the first several days, we were really focused on that. And on the day of the election, we visited 7 or 8 polling stations around La Paz, and were tasked with observing the process, noting any irregularities if we saw them. And before I get into discussing the media's role in propping up the coup, which took place last year in 2019, which Claudia already began touching upon, I just wanted to share my experience in terms of actually observing the electoral process, because it was fascinating for me to see the Bolivian system, especially right before coming back and dealing with an election here in the United States that's just become one for the history books. Not that I believe there was fraud in the United States, but we lack a centralized system that states are left to their own devices, and that at least left the opening for people to cast doubt on the electoral results. And actually what happened in the United States this year, and now what the Trump administration and others were using to cry foul, is exactly what happened in Bolivia last year, which is initially on election night, it seemed as though President Trump had actually won a second term here in the United States. But then in the days afterwards, as mail-in ballots were counted, the vote went in the direction of Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate. In Bolivia last year, something similar happened and that was the basis for the fraud allegation, which was vocalized by the Organization of American States. And that is, on election night, because of the regions and the cities, the major cities, which were counted first in Bolivia in 2019, it looked as though Carlos Mesa, the neoliberal consensus candidate, was ahead in Bolivia. And then in the days afterwards, as the more rural regions of the country had their vote counted, Morales surged in the polls. And that was not a surprise to anyone who understood the makeup of Bolivia's political life. But this is the main irregularity which the OAS pointed to in order to say, look, his 10% margin of victory, Evo's 10% margin of victory in Bolivia was illegitimate. And I can say now, at the time, people such as myself and actual analysts, such as those who work for a think tank here in Washington, D.C. called the Center for Economic and Policy Research, raised serious questions about the OAS report, tried to point out that it was based on faulty math and that it wasn't accounting for the fact that it makes sense, actually, that MAS, el Movimiento Socialismo's base of support was in this rural area, these rural areas which were counted later. It makes sense, actually, that Morales would experience a boost in the polls as these votes came in. I already had seen so many reports now over the last year confirming what CEPR, that think tank I referenced, found, which is that the OAS report was completely faulty. But after seeing the Bolivian system myself, I can say that with even more confidence, because the way that the vote is counted in Bolivia is it happens mostly in the open. You can go, I'm sure this is similar to the way it works in the UK, at least in the United States. You go to your individual polling station, you cast your vote. But in Bolivia, there's a process of really making sure not only that the identity of the person voting is checked and confirmed, but that one thing I loved was that they actually hold up the ballot before an individual walks into the voting booth, shows that it's empty, shows that it's blank. They announce it, then the person takes the ballot, goes in and votes, comes out, marks the voting list with their thumb, and puts their ballot in in the box, in the which is ultimately, once the voting has come to an end, opened, and the votes are again counted for all to see. They actually pick up the ballots at these individual tables, mesas within the polling station, and journalists, electoral observers, and just any citizen who really wants to be present can be in the room in these polling stations and watch as the electoral staff holds up the ballot, announces the party, which one. It's just pictures you see of the major candidates. There's an X marking who was selected by that voter, and then it's marked on a tally sheet right behind the individual who's counting the votes. So it's pretty open. And after the individual tables tally their vote, it's put together in the total from the individual polling site of all the tables put together is tallied, and then that goes on to the Central Electoral Council. And so the entire time this was happening on election day, excuse me, in Bolivia last month, I was with my team from the Gray Zone and also from Code Pink, an anti-war organization in the United States. And we were speaking with each other, how are they going to steal this? Because it's so open. People all around the country were mobilized. MAS as a party was mobilized to be present in as many polling stations as possible so that they actually could trace the audits of the polling stations, so that once these votes were turned over to the government, they couldn't just make any number they wanted, because people around the country had mobilized to track the individual voting results at these polling sites. And it turned out that they just simply couldn't do it. They couldn't fudge the numbers, especially this time when it wasn't just almost the 10% needed to avoid a second round or runoff election. It was so overwhelmingly, the vote was so overwhelmingly in support of MAS that even if Camacho and Carlos Mesa, the two opposition candidates, Fernando Camacho being the extreme right-wing candidate and Mesa being the neoliberal centrist who had previously worked and served as president before Morales took power, even if you combine the votes that those two opposition candidates received, MAS received more votes in this last election. So the mandate MAS received was so overwhelming that because of the openness of the election, it couldn't just be fudge. They couldn't change the numbers. The way last year they said, oh, well, it's not quite, he lied, and so the margin is actually not the 10% needed to avoid a runoff. He has to go to a runoff. He's corrupt. And because of the support the media gave this OAS report, the military was able to come in and make it look as though in the media they were preserving democracy. That wouldn't have happened this time. It wouldn't have worked out as well. It would have been I of course already, and I'm sure everyone on this panel already saw what happened last year as a blatant military coup, but this would have been almost too naked if they were going to override a vote of over 20% in favor of MAS. And so what happened on the day of was very interesting, because we started hearing from contacts that MAS was confident they'd won the election, but what happened was exit polls which were expected around 8 p.m. on election day weren't coming through. And people started to wonder, there was a lot of anxiety, maybe they are trying to manipulate the numbers in some way. They obviously don't want people to know the results of this election. And so there was like a 4-hour period from around 8 p.m. when we were expecting exit polls to midnight, when it felt as though perhaps they were implementing another coup. But something remarkable happened shortly after midnight, which was that all of the media networks in Bolivia, which under the coup regime have just become a mouthpiece of that military dictatorship. There is no diversity in media. I found that very quickly arriving to the country, because there was almost no Mas voices included in coverage of the election in the lead up to the vote. They were airing these just very disturbing propaganda videos suggesting that indigenous people were going to cause violence on election day on the major networks. But shortly after midnight on election day, those networks began to announce exit polls showing an overwhelming victory for the Mas party. And there suddenly was this sense of relief in the streets. People had gathered in front of the Mas headquarters. People started shooting off fireworks and shooting bullets in the air to celebrate. I mean, it was pretty relaxed, I think, compared to what it would have been without the outbreak of coronavirus taking over not only Bolivia, but everywhere at the moment. But there was celebration in the streets that night, because there was this feeling that the organized workers and the people of the country had finally taken it back. And so I just wanted to give people an idea of the process there, because I think after I saw it myself, I was even more disgusted with the report put forward by the OAS last year, because there's just no way they could have manipulated the results to favor Evo last year, especially thinking that this military dictatorship couldn't even pull that off this time around. So before I end, I just wanted to speak about how the media, the international media, really just took that initial OAS report alleging fraud, and ran with it in order to legitimize the coup government. I don't think the military junta could have taken over without the international media accepting this narrative hook, line, and sinker the way it did. And so I just want to read a few headlines or tidbits of news which we received last year following the election, and then also reflect on some of the stories which even came out around this election, starting with the Associated Press. Last year on November 11th, 2019, this was the day Evo Morales was forced to flee Bolivia. This was the day right after the OAS released its initial report claiming fraud. The AP, the International Wire Service, published a report reading, Bolivia has entered a sudden era of political uncertainty with the resignation of President Evo Morales after a push by the military and weeks of massive protests. Morales resigned after nearly 14 years in power. So it was just a little push from the military. That is one way of characterizing a coup, I suppose. And then there's no mention of the fact that Evo was elected for those 14 years. They just make it sound as though he reigned for 14 years and he's a dictator who was pushed out by the people, and that the military were somehow acting on behalf of a massive social movement in the streets. So that's a real obvious whitewash of the coup by the Associated Press. Then we have The Economist. Evo Morales was a casualty of a counter-revolution aimed at defending democracy against electoral fraud and his own illegal candidacy. That was from November 14th, 2019, making just a blatantly false statement that his candidacy was illegal last year. The Supreme Court actually gave him the green light to seek this fourth term. And then again, characterizing a military coup as a counter-revolution is just absolutely egregious. And The Economist, I actually subscribe to it because I like to see what the anonymous capitalist class has to say about the world. It's a good window into the mindset of the elite, but you are going to come away with pretty disturbing and disappointing coverage, such as that headline I just read. Then, after the massacres in Bolivia carried out by the coup government, within the first week, dozens of people, the military actually fired upon protests demanding Evo's return and killed dozens of people, at least dozens of people, including in Senkata, outside of a gas plant in El Alto, which is a large neighborhood which rests just above La Paz in Bolivia. It's a huge, massive barrio filled with working people just outside of what's not the technical capital of Bolivia, but essentially the political capital, La Paz. And there was a huge protest outside of Senkata to mourn the deaths of others who'd been killed by the military that week. And the Associated Press released a story covering the Senkata massacre. And this is a line from their story describing, again, an all-out massacre assault on an unarmed population of peaceful demonstrators in the street. Officials raised the death toll by 8 a day after security forces cleared a blockade of a fuel plant by anti-government protesters in the city of El Alto near La Paz. What does that even mean? Officials raised the death toll by 8 after security forces cleared a blockade. How creative can you get with ways of saying security forces murdered people on behalf of the government? I don't know if they teach this in journalism school in the United States. I didn't go to journalism school, but it seems like you actually need training to come up with such doublespeak. I mean, that's just outrageous. And moving along, more recently in February of this year, the Washington Post in the United States released a story actually admitting that their research didn't find any fraud. This is months later, of course, because the Washington Post, along with other outlets, went along with the OAS report in October 2019. And they still repeat several talking points, just that Morales claimed victory in the October election, what was called electoral fraud. And I should say that even the New York Times this year, along with the Washington Post, admitted after not only, I mentioned the CEPA report, but a separate report from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, as well as academics from Tulane University and the University of Pennsylvania in the United States, did their own audits of the election and the OAS report and found it faulty. So it forced the Washington Post and the New York Times to kind of double back and say, well, we may have been incorrect, but it didn't. It just shows so much about these papers that they didn't initially question the narrative brought down by the OAS when there were other people raising questions. More recently, in just surrounding the news around the most recent election last month, AP published another story characterizing Evo in the following way. They say Evo's support was eroding due to his reluctance to leave power, increasing authoritarian impulses, and a series of corruption scandals. He shrugged aside a public vote that had term limits, and a lengthy pause in reporting results fed suspicions of fraud, and nationwide protests broke out. When police and military leaders suggested he leave, Morales resigned and fled the country. This was an AP report published on October 19th of this year. So no mention of the fact that, again, the Washington Post, the New York Times, all of these academics and institutions have already come forward and delegitimized the OAS report. They just repeat the talking points once again, that there was a lengthy pause in results, which led to suspicion of fraud. But then saying that police and military leaders suggested Morales leave, and that's why he resigned and fled the country. He actually fled under threats against his life. And immediately after he left, he was actually in hiding in Bolivia before he was able to get to Mexico. And the night of October or November 11th last year, right-wing militias raided his home. They murdered his dogs. These people are extremely dangerous. And so to just say that the police and military simply suggested he leave is, again, a fancy way of saying that there were threats against Evo's life. I think I'm almost out of time, or I probably have gone over my time limit now. So the last thing I'll point out is that, at least in the United States, there was also an issue with alternative left-wing media, not after the coup. It's very easy, I think, for these outlets to say that a coup is wrong, or that that they support a government or a movement after it's been forcibly removed from power. But there were a few outlets, such as Jacobin magazine, which started attacking, and these are in many cases not Bolivian academics or social movement leaders, but people based in the United States and elsewhere, criticizing the Bolivian government, claiming that Evo Morales is authoritarian or that he's capitalist, and even sowing a kind of opposition to these governments from the left. And there was even an article, I think, in The Intercept, which compared Evo to Jair Bolsonaro during these wildfires taking place in the Amazon last year. And I think that's something to be aware of, because it's one thing, again, to say that coups are wrong and that these military governments have no authority. But if you spend your entire time attacking these governments when they're actually in power, I think you end up playing into the hand of the people who come in and ultimately delegitimize them. So criticizing the government, of course, is something that should be left to Bolivian people, but I think we should be conscious of left-wing or progressive alternative media outlets that play into this narrative. And I'll end with that, because I think I've probably gone for too long. So thank you.
Thank you, Anya. I think with these kind of meetings, we're a bit more flexible on letting people speak, because it's just such an interesting to hear from people and hear from people who've experienced it themselves. And we've certainly heard in the past about people observing elections across Latin America, and stating things such as yourself has mentioned, and how different what the mainstream media portray it as to what actually happens. So no, it's a welcome discussion. And I don't think time is something we're going to have to worry about when we hand over to Francisco in a second. Our final speaker is Francisco Dominguez. He's the head of Latin America Studies in Middlesex University. He's a great friend of Unison Northwest, and it's great to have him along with us again tonight. So over to you, Francisco.
Thank you very much, Tracy. I can see that my reputation preceded me. Thanks very much for the invite. It's great that the Northwest organization has organized this seminar, because it's important to know and get the details. There is plenty to know, and there is also plenty to learn from this experience. Certainly, those in the Latin American left, those who really lead mass movements, are looking into it very carefully. I'll come back to that point in a minute. I want to start by focusing on one guy whose name is Luis Almagro. Luis Almagro is the General Secretary of the Organization of American States. He played an absolutely disgusting role. He normally plays a disgusting role, whatever he does. But with regards to the issue of Bolivia, with the elections in 2019, he deliberately, and it's been demonstrated irrefutably, he deliberately sent a team to manipulate a very small sample of results, of electoral results, in order to demonstrate that there had been fraud, which later on was demonstrated this was not the case by academics, studies, and so on, and the actual facts. And what is important about this is the very fact that it was his report, the report of the Organization of American States, that declared pretty openly that the election had been a fraud, that actually instigated the coup d'etat. I think there was a plan. Clearly there was a plan. And I think it was very well orchestrated by all sorts of dark forces inside Bolivia as well as outside. I think the moment the information, the report was announced, I don't have more time to go into details, then everything was set off. And it was quite violent. The coup against Evo Morales was extremely violent. Just a couple of pieces of information regarding this. Armed thugs went into the houses of ministers of the Evo Morales government and kidnapped their families, held them hostages, and forced these ministers to make statements they did not want to. And in many cases, their houses were burned. The house of Evo Morales' sister was burned by the thugs, and they went around on the rampage, attacking anything and everything that looked indigenous. This is not difficult to do in Bolivia, and the reason is about 65% of the population of Bolivia are actually of indigenous origin. So you can, wherever you go, you will see, and the brunt of the racist attacks were suffered by indigenous women. They went for them. I mean, it's a real nasty, racist, disgusting thing. Now, Evo Morales in November 2019 got 47% of the vote. This is the final tally that we know. According to the information, this was sufficient for him to have been elected then, because he had more than 10% over the second runner. What is extraordinary, and this is one to highlight in my second point, is the victory in 2020, which is unbelievable. I could not believe myself, even though generally I'm very optimistic about political developments, wherever they happen, particularly Latin America. Let me give you some of the figures. Not only the MAS, the movement towards socialism, won 55%, that is to say 8 points more than it won 1 year earlier, but it did it under extremely difficult conditions, because throughout that year, the Añez government launched a wave of repression, launched a wave of persecution. Leaders, and some of them are still under detention, were arrested, were persecuted. The judiciary was used in order to accuse them of all imaginable terrible things. For example, Evo Morales himself was charged with terrorism. And the basis of the charge was a piece of paper that was found in the hands of the secretary that had nothing to do with terrorism. And yet he was charged with terrorism. So you can imagine what a very right-wing government would do to somebody who they claim to be a terrorist. They persecuted everything, and their plan was, and clearly this came from Washington in my view, the extreme right-wing in Latin America are not that clever. They don't think strategically that much. So this plan was, what you need to do is to actually demonstrate that the MAS is a terrorist organization, it behaves illegally, and so forth throughout that period, in order to legalize it. Something in a smaller scale they have done against Lula in Brazil. Once you are neutralized Lula by accusing him of all sorts of charges who were all trumped up, then you make sure that he wasn't a candidate. And as a result, that's Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro was elected. Their plan was failed, and this is the reason why it failed. In my experience, and I've been around for a while, in my experience, I haven't seen a movement with such amount of discipline, with such amount of being able to, number one, regroup because they were under attack. Number two, listening very carefully to the leadership's instructions or advice not to go for, definite and terrible confrontations, because that will justify what the regime wanted to do, which was to go, for broke. And not only they were good, they began slowly in a sort of involved movement to start, winning terrain and winning spaces. And I couldn't believe it. In 2020, they won the election with 55%. But there is more, which is, we say in London, is better in terms of the figures. They won in 6 departments out of 9. And in terms of the provinces, in Bolivia, there are 112 provinces. The MAS won in 98. They won 75 positions in the Senate out of 130. Sorry, 75 positions in the Congress out of 130 deputies. And in the Senate, the MAS got 21 out of 36. If you go further down, which is even more interesting, when you go to the level of the municipalities, that is to say, the lowest possible level at the grassroots, there are 353 municipalities in Bolivia. The MAS won in 314 of them. And in terms of the overall results, the MAS got 55%, nearly 56%. Mesa got 28%, and the extreme right wing got 14%. Now, the MAS in La Paz got 68% of the vote. In Argentina, which is the exile, they won 88%. But that is not that significant statistically, but it's quite significant politically. In Cochabamba, the MAS got 66%. In Oruro, they got 62%, and in Potosi, they got 57%. And even in those places where the right won, the performance of the MAS was absolutely formidable. I mean, they got, in some cases, they got 45%. In other cases, they got nearly 40%. So they have a very good presence everywhere. And the idea of what Claudia was talking about, the Media Luna, the sort of half of the country being controlled by the right wing, is gone. I mean, they have a little bit, and that's part of democracy. And I think this is going to be quite interesting to consolidate. Now, what have they done? I want to say a couple of things about the first measures that Luis Arce has indicated that he's going to undertake. Obviously, there is going to be more in the near future because it's just become inaugurated. But the first thing he's going to do is to give a bonus against hunger, which is 1,000 Bolivian pesos, which is around $150, around 110 sterling pounds. This is for people who are in a very desperate situation. It's quite important to understand this. Even though Bolivia, went through an extraordinary period of about 10 years of a rate of growth of approximately 4 something percent, which is quite strong. And they reduced poverty quite massively, more than half. Nevertheless, the informal sector of the economy in Bolivia is quite strong, it's huge. So in the context of the dictatorship and in the context of the pandemic, if you cannot go to work, it's very likely that many people are not going to be able to eat because they need the money that day. They earn money literally daily. So the situation of many, many people actually is quite precarious. The bonus against hunger is going to benefit approximately 4 million people. And this is from the president, the new president, Luis Arce, who was the Minister of Economics of Evo Morales. The second thing they're going to do is they're going to reduce VAT. Can you imagine, the Bolivians should tell something to the Western governments about how to handle crisis. Reduction of the VAT for credit cards from 13% to 8%. They're going to return VAT to people in low income. Obviously, the figures, they have to work out exactly how many and so on. They're going to apply extra tax or extra taxation on big fortunes. This is real estate, assets, as well as actual money that these rich people may have in the bank or somewhere else. Then they're going to try to obtain credit from multilateral bodies such as the World Bank and the IMF, and this is problematical because of the conditions. But Luis Arce made it very, very clear that he's not going to prepare, he's not prepared to accept any conditionalities. In other words, I think he's preparing the ground for the World Bank and the IMF to say, unless you accept our conditions, we're not going to give the money for Luis Arce to go somewhere else. I don't know exactly where he might go. I have an idea of where, but I think this is it. And this is quite important because the key, as Luis Arce has explained it, is to reactivate the economy. They need to reactivate the economy to ensure that the standard of living of those at the very bottom of the pile, because of the crisis of the pandemic and the crisis caused by the policies of the Añez government, the de facto government, is absolutely essential that the economy recovers. And then he said that they are going to work on the judiciary. I think it's quite welcome from my point of view anyway. They're going to work on the judiciary to make sure that the judiciary is professionally inspired and obeys to the rule of law rather than lawfare, which is what they apply, against the mass during all this period. Then he made a sort of bomb of an announcement. He said he was going to restore relations with Venezuela and Cuba right away that have been broken off by the Añez government. And the latest information is that Alfredo Cuellar, the commander of the strategic operations, who is key in the massacres in Senkata, for example, he's been arrested because he's going to be tried for his responsibility in this. And I'm sure there will be more. Several of the ministers of the Añez government actually are in exile in the United States and somewhere else, and many of them are trying to escape. And the situation regarding the COVID itself is quite bad. Bolivia, checking today the Johns Hopkins University information, is 144,000 cases with nearly 9,000 deaths, which is quite high. So in a nutshell, what you have is, I think, the extraordinary political fiat performed by the Bolivian people that under the most horrific conditions, they were able to actually win this extraordinary victory and absolutely all the levels of the politics of the institution, they reasserted themselves so strongly. And what they say to us, that we have been in communication with Claudia, we're working with the Bolivians and so on, they say to us, it was great you people gave us solidarity during this year, but the situation is going to be difficult for us to recover everything that we had and continue to progress. And in order for us to be able to do that, we're going to need your solidarity. I want to come to two final points, if I may, Chair. The Añez government wrecked Bolivia in 6 months. They apply neoliberal policies so brutally, so stupidly. They privatized anything and everything they could. And they opened the country, to anybody, deteriorating the position of the people quite dramatically, contracting the domestic market quite terribly. And the consequences is some huge economic crisis that they have. This is interesting because I think it's a record. Macri in Argentina, the right-wing president, took 4 years to wreck the Argentinian economy. Lenin Moreno in Ecuador did better because he wrecked the economy of Ecuador in 3 years. Jair Bolsonaro wrecked the economy of Brazil in 1 year by applying exactly the same policies, but the Bolivian government did it only in 6 months. This is extraordinary. Now, let me tell you what I think it means, and I'll finish with this, Chair and comrades. The significance of the victory of Bolivia actually changes the relation of forces in the region quite dramatically. We already can see this taking place. There is one fundamental reason for this, in my view. The right wing, led by the United States, whether it is Trump or whether it is somebody else, from our point of view, it doesn't make a difference. We will defend ourselves regardless. the right wing is able to score important victories, such as what they have done, you know, with the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, with the annulment of the possibility of Lula being candidate, with coups d'etat in Honduras in 2009, in Paraguay in 2012, and so forth. So they're able to score victories. But because of their politics and because of their policies, they are not able to consolidate these gains. So very soon they become under attack. And what is interesting is that their victories do not amount to historic victories such as the one they inflicted on the Chilean people with Pinochet, where it took us a generation to actually recover and begin, you know, the way back. Whereas in these places that I mentioned, it takes only 1, 2, 3, 4 years. It's painful, it's terrible, but it doesn't amount to historic defeat, which is quite important. So therefore, a very experienced leadership that knows what they're doing and knows the terrain can actually recruit and gain the terrain back. So let me give you a couple of figures more. Whereas the Bolivians won with 55% and all the rest of it that I gave you, the Chilean referendum to change the economic model, that is to say, to change not only the constitution, but neoliberalism in Chile, got 77% of the vote, which is absolutely extraordinary. So here you have two examples of a massive transformation. Then the Peruvian government collapsed. You had in Peru, as a result of mass mobilizations, you had 3 governments in 1 week. 3 is another record. 3 governments in 1 week, one after another, was being pushed out more or less by the pressure of mass mobilization. And the masses now are not only demanding elections, they are demanding a constituent assembly because they want to start from zero, which is great. Let's see how far they go. And 2 days ago, just heard that the government in Guatemala is under huge pressure by a huge social explosion from the mass of the people over there. And what is extraordinary is 2 things. I don't know exactly who is responsible for this, but it's an indication of how dramatic things are. The building of parliament, which is the den of corruption, was attacked by the masses and was set on fire. So you have the images of the masses, you know, sort of going for their thing, like in Paris in 1789. And then you have the Vice President of the Republic calling on the president publicly to resign together for the good of the country. That is to say, that country in a total crisis, and to top everything up. My English is failing me now. You had that, whatever the complexities and difficulties and caveats we want to put into the analysis, Trump has been defeated in the United States. And poor Joe Biden, he inherits an economy and a society in a big mess. I'm not sure, and this is a purely speculative point that I want to make, I'm not sure how much he and his administration are going to be able to just continue exactly as Trump was doing. We'll see how far they go. What is clear is that we stopped the neoliberal march. We are setting it back. We started from Bolivia. We also had it in Chile. In February 2021, there will be elections in Ecuador. I think we are very likely to win. We have a left-wing government in Mexico. We have another left-wing government in Argentina. Venezuela survived. Nicaragua survived. Cuba is still there. So it doesn't look too bad at all. So viva Bolivia. Thank you very much, comrades.
Thanks, Francisco. Great information and you know, explaining it as always. We do have a couple of questions that have been put in the chat, so I'm not sure if anybody's seen them. But what I can do is, if you want, I can call you in to ask the question, or are you happy for me to do it?
If that's okay, I mean, obviously it depends on what
so
the other
we've got a
panelists want to do.
question from Lisa. Lisa, do you want to ask your question? If we keep the questions to questions rather than a bit of a speech, we'll be able to get everyone to ask their question, if that's all right.
Yeah, so I asked what role the media played in the rise of the right, because obviously, in the UK. I think mainstream media particularly has led to us having a Tory government, and I just wondered, within sort of your own domains, how much the media played into that and gave the far right that power.
Thanks, Lisa. We'll take this. There's 2 more questions, so we'll do the questions, and then if the 3 speakers want to feedback, then that's great. So the next question was from Kev. Do you want to ask yours?
Thanks, Tracy. I'd like the panelists' views on the European Union's complicity in the 2019 coup in Bolivia.
Thanks, Kev. And then we've got one from Nigel.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. I just wanted to ask, what role, if any, did the trade union movement play in opposing the coup and then campaigning for the government?
Thanks, Nigel. Francisco, I think you're unmuted. Do you want to respond first, or does Claudia or anyone?
I would be happy with going for the European one, if that's okay. Perhaps, you know, Anya would go for the media one because she knows much more than we all do. But
yeah, that's perfect. That's
okay, and then the trainers maybe. Okay, so
I may have already. I shared all of my links and explanation on the way the international media covered it. I don't know. I feel like maybe Claudia can speak more to the rise of the right domestically if she knows.
Well, actually, thank you. I wanted to add media in Bolivia, right? How we have people like this newspaper, El Deber, we have TV channels, Unitel, we have anyway, some media outlets in Bolivia that are definitely bought, that are definitely far right, and they always have been. And they are the majority, they are the major outlets that there is in the country. There is also another guy called Garafulik, who is an owner of a newspaper that is it is highly associated, and they're absolutely chums with Garcia Mesa. And what's really interesting in this is that whenever there were polls, El MAS was obviously winning always. And we cannot imagine how much we were winning by in the polls, that these newspapers that were far right had to admit that they were winning. But of course they would reduce the percentage and the rates. But even then had to admit that we were winning. That was very hopeful for us that we're seeing from outside. I think for people like ourselves that were campaigning from abroad, from Europe, it was really difficult it was a daily fight, because whatever the left movement did, it was hugely criticized, it was hugely exaggerated, and you know, all of these massacres and killings and shooting and tanks coming to Sacaba, Senkata, they were not shown on mainstream media, or they will be played down. And part of it, and just to add to something that someone, and actually I do want to congratulate Grace Son for being who they were, for doing what they did, because it really supported us, especially abroad, to have some material, and have some content. People like Causa Chuncoca, the news outlet there that is very indigenous, supported and run by in El Chapare, which is a city in El Trópico Boliviano. They were attacked hugely, and they're socialist left, and they have very close. They've been a key element for the media in Bolivia. Another bit that, just to end with this, something that many people perhaps don't know, of course, abroad, is that when Yanine Áñez got into government, one of the first things she did is that she shut down, she stopped funding to 46 community radios and channels across the country. So this means that there was a total shutdown of left socialist radios and media press across Bolivia. So of course, the right dominated the country. There was no other information to find out. And then the people that were creating this movement were fed on a daily basis by lies and, you know, lawfare news and fake news as well. So yeah, they play a big role. But we won. Hayaya Bolivia.
Thank you. Anya, did you want to contribute? Or?
I can speak to the last question just to point out that this election in Bolivia in October wouldn't have happened without the trade unions and social movements in Bolivia organizing on a massive scale. This was the fourth date the government had set for the vote. They delayed it 3 times previously, finding excuses such as the coronavirus outbreak, because they knew that it was going to be very difficult for them to win any democratic election, and also that due to the fact, as Francisco really drove home, that the government destroyed the economy even before the outbreak of coronavirus, they'd lost a section of support that is reflected in the result we saw in October. What's interesting about Bolivia for me was that voting is actually obligatory. Everybody in the country is required to vote, otherwise you can face penalties. And so when you see a huge 8% change in the mandate that Mas received this year as opposed to last, that you can roughly estimate is the same group of people who voted the year before. And that means that perhaps the middle class, this 8% of people who were not enthusiastic about Evo last year, saw what it meant to live under a neoliberal military coup regime for only a few months, and that was enough to have them switch in just a year's time. But still, because of this failure of the government, they tried to delay the elections repeatedly. And so Mas, and this is something else I learned during my travels there, speaking with journalist Ali Vargas, who works for Causacha News, the media outlet Claudia just mentioned. He explained to me how Bolivia, the Mas as a political party, it's not the way, it doesn't function the way I understand a political party to function in the United States, which is, we basically have a party structure that's non-existent. It represents a small section of the elite. People vote for one party or the other, but they're not participating in it in their everyday life. But Mas is actually made up of social movements. You have to be in a social movement or in a trade union. And then that organization of these trade unions and social movements is the actual structure of the party. That's why you have union leaders at the helm of the party or in very high positions of leadership. And they represent the vast majority of people, of working people, of indigenous people in Bolivia as a party. And so they had the capacity to shut the country down entirely through strikes, through roadblocks. And that's what they did. That's what they did throughout the summer in order to demand their right to vote, because they knew if they were given that opportunity, they had a very good chance of taking the country back. And that's exactly what happened. But it didn't. In the United States, there was, or in more liberal circles, I saw this talking point put forward that Bolivians defeated fascism at the ballot box, and it was such a victory for democracy. But what Bolivia really showed is that democracy, real democracy, is much more than the ballot box, because they wouldn't have had access to the ballot box if it weren't for the massive organization of the people, of working people in Bolivia who had the power to hurt the country's economy, to pressure the government to call these elections and follow through and hold the elections. And I think that is such an inspiring model here that I think we should learn from in the United States. I know your Labour Party in the UK is struggling at the moment to have a real connection to its base and to stand up for working people in the country. So we should look to Bolivia and see that before we have a successful political movement or a political party of working people, we actually need organized labor and to be organized in the workplace and to have an actual movement of working people. Otherwise, it will never translate into political power.
Thank you, and there's definitely so much we can learn here in the UK and getting that message across, definitely, because it does make a difference. Francisco, do you want to come in on, was it Kev's question for the European Union?
Just a little bit on what was being said. Gleisi Hoffmann, the president of the Workers' Party of Brazil, gave a very interesting webinar that I watched. And in that she said, we are looking into the case of Bolivia very carefully indeed, because one of the things that never happened in Bolivia, which did happen to us, she said, to them, the Workers' Party, was that in Bolivia, they never lost the connection with the rank and file, never, ever. And they never demobilized the rank and file or disarticulated them. They kept them strong and they kept that connection. It wasn't perfect. There were also the complications. Nevertheless, that was maintained. And she said, we in Brazil didn't do that. And as a result of that, we lost the connection with the rank and file and we demobilized them. So when it came to the question of our defense, when the right wing attacked, you know, we were a bit naked. She didn't use that phrase, but I think that's what she meant. Politically, when you don't have your base that is organized to defend you, then the right wing can have a field day, which is what they did. So that is number one. And a second related point, but not necessarily to the question of the mass movement, Luis Arce, as part of his recent announcement, is going to change the whole of the military high command. He's already announced it, which, you know, is a very salutary measure considering their experience. I mean, they learn very quickly, very fast. Now, on the question of the European Union, my view has always been this: nothing legitimizes US foreign policy more than the support it gets from the European Union. And it gets it all the time, even when supporting the United States foreign policy means, you know, attacking the interests of the European Union itself, which is their abject slavishness is so pathetic. The trouble is, I wouldn't mind, you know, there are pathetic politicians all over the place, but I wouldn't mind if that didn't have any consequences on Latin America or anywhere else, the Middle East or the rest of the world, but it does. Because international public opinion is determined really largely by this alliance. What they say and what their media say and what their politicians say, what their parliaments and governments say goes. And that's what prevails as the narrative. So therefore, being able to complicate, to neutralize, or even to defeat, which is more difficult, the support that the European Union gives to the United States all the time on anything, everything, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba is not that clear, but whatever it is, then it immediately creates this international narrative and legitimizes it. Every time when the European Union has adopted an independent foreign policy, for example, on the question of Cuba, then the United States immediately isolated. So this is very strategic from our point of view. And their role is so pathetic. For example, every time that somebody on the left in any government in Latin America does whatever, however small, even if it is false, the European Union almost immediately makes very strong remarks, comments, statements, and so on. You know, and this is the Commission, let alone the Parliament. The European Parliament is much worse than the Commission because it issues statements and policies and passes resolutions, rather, which are absolutely terrible. And obviously, this creates this context which I was talking about, you know, where it legitimizes everything. So when Luis Almagro misbehaved, to be very diplomatic, misbehaved by manipulating the figures in Bolivia, which led to the coup d'etat, what the European Union should have done, in terms of their own principles on which they are supposed to rest. We have the documents, we have read them. They should have immediately condemned what Luis Almagro had done, and they should have called for his resignation immediately. They have a representative in the Organization of American States. There is a European Union representative that attends every single meeting. Nevertheless, they didn't do that. What have other governments in Latin America have done? López Obrador instructed his ambassador to make it totally clear, that Almagro should go and should resign. Luis Arce has called for the resignation of Luis Almagro immediately, and so has obviously others. And Evo Morales said he's going to take the case of his crime, because it's a crime, what he committed, Luis Almagro. He's taking the case to the International Court. So let's hope that that prevails. And when it comes, therefore, to the European Union, we have this complication. Now I think they've been supporting Trump on just about everything, including, obviously, Nicaragua, certainly on the go on Bolivia, which is part and parcel of the same pattern. And I think they've been waiting for perhaps Joe Biden take a different stand and maybe, propose something else. And for the time being, I imagine the European Union politicians must have been extremely nervous because Donald Trump was delaying and delaying and delaying and delaying, the inauguration and the transition to a Joe Biden administration in order for them to be able to express a sigh of relief and maybe do something else. So this is the problem. There are, and I'll finish with this, there are sufficient political forces and social forces in Europe that we need to organize, that we need to master, that we need to mobilize, and we can neutralize. If we're able to neutralize, only neutralize, this support for the United States, even if they abstain, that would be a huge step forward for humanity. And my position is the European Union should stop coattailing to US imperialism and adopt an independent foreign policy. Even if it's not a socialist one, just independent would be good enough. I rest my case.
Thank you. I've not had any more questions put on, but if any of the speakers do have any links that you've referred to and would like to share with the people who've registered for this call, just send them through for the email and we can share them so people have got them. Just thank you again for such excellent contributions, and I think we could probably sit here for another few hours listening and having this discussion, but it's people's night time. It's been an excellent meeting and thank you very much, and we hope to hold something similar again going forward with Bolivia.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Viva Bolivia.
Thank you
Allá, Bolivia.
to other speakers and for all of you for hosting us.